The analysis of the skeleton proved that it was an adult male, but with an unusually slender, almost feminine build for a man. This is in keeping with historical sources, which describe Richard as being of very slender build. There is, however, no indication that he had a withered arm. Both arms were of a similar size, and both were used normally during life. The skeleton is that of an individual aged between the late 20s and late 30s. We know that Richard III was 32 when he died, and this is entirely consistent with the Greyfriars skeleton. We have used measurements of the long bones to produce an estimate of height, but this is complicated by the presence of the scoliosis. Without the spinal abnormality, the Greyfriars skeleton would have stood roughly 5 foot 8 inches high. This would have been above average height for a medieval male. However, the curve in the spine would have taken a significant amount off his apparent height when standing. We cannot be sure exactly how much this would have been, but it would have been substantial. The analysis of the scoliosis took place together with Professor Bruno Morgan of the University of Leicester and Dr. Piers Mitchell of the University of Cambridge. This showed that the Greyfriars skeleton had a condition known as idiopathic adolescent onset scoliosis. The word idiopathic is a complicated medical term for a simple fact. The cause of the scoliosis is unclear. What we do know is that this individual was not born with scoliosis, but that it developed after the age of 10. The condition would have put additional strain on the heart and lungs, and it may have caused pain, but we cannot be specific about this. Finally, I would like to discuss the evidence for trauma on the skeleton. This has been identified using a variety of imaging techniques that have allowed us to look at the bones in different ways. The analysis has involved Professor Sarah Hainsworth and Richard Earp from our Department of Engineering, Professor Guy Rutty, Professor Bruno Morgan, Alison Brough, and Claire Robinson from our East Midlands Forensic Pathology Unit and University Radiology Imaging Units, and Bob Woosnam-Savage from the Royal Armouries, Leeds. We are also grateful to the University of Bradford Biological Anthropology Research Centre, who allowed us to carry out comparative analysis of individuals who died in the 1461 Battle of Towton. In our press conference in September, we discussed 2 possible wounds on the skeleton. We have now identified 10 wounds. 8 of these are on the skull, whilst 2 are elsewhere on the body. All of the wounds have characteristics that identify them as perimortem, i.e. occurring at or shortly after the time of death. They could not have been inflicted after the burial of this individual, and none could have been caused by damage during excavation. Because none of the wounds overlapped, it is not possible to say for certain the order in which the injuries were received, but we can make certain speculations on the basis of what we know about medieval warfare. I will discuss each of the injuries briefly, making clear the degree of certainty of our conclusions in each case. In September, we said that we had identified a small penetrating wound on the top of the head, and you can see that here. Analysis suggests that this was caused by a direct blow from a weapon rather than by a projectile such as an arrowhead. This injury would not have been fatal. The second wound that we discussed in September was a large wound to the base of the skull at the back, and you can see that wound here. We said that this might represent a slice cut off the skull by a bladed weapon. Our work has now shown that this is indeed the case. We cannot say for certain exactly what weapon caused this injury, but it is consistent with something similar to a halberd. A smaller injury, also on the base of the skull, was caused by a bladed weapon which penetrated through to the inner surface of the skull opposite the entry point, a distance of 10.5 centimetres. You can see that second smaller injury here. Both of these injuries would have caused almost instant loss of consciousness, and death would have followed quickly afterwards. In the case of the larger wound, if the blade had penetrated 7 centimetres into the brain, which we cannot determine from the bones, death would have been instantaneous. A further 3 wounds have been identified on the outer surface of the vault of the skull. These are shallow wounds, highly consistent with where the blade of a weapon such as a sword or halberd has shaved off a small area of bone, and you can clearly see one of these areas here. These wounds would not have been immediately fatal, but could have caused death through blood loss if left untreated for a long period of time. In addition to these, there is a small rectangular injury on the cheekbone, which you can see here. Again, we cannot be certain what caused it, but it would be consistent with a dagger. The weapon that caused this injury pierced the cheek and came out on the side of the face. If inflicted during life, this wound would not have been fatal. Finally, on the skull, there is a cut mark on the lower jaw. You can just see this at the bottom of the image here. This is caused by a bladed weapon consistent with a knife or dagger. Again, if inflicted during life, this wound would not have been fatal. It is hard to understand how any of these injuries could have been caused if this individual had been wearing a protective helmet. We therefore suggest that this may have been lost by this stage in the battle. The injuries to the jaw and cheek are particularly interesting in that they are less severe than attacks to the face seen in other medieval battle victims. This has led us to suggest that they may reflect attacks on the body after death, although we cannot confirm this directly from the bones. Examples of such humiliation injuries are well known from the forensic and historical literature, and historical sources have suggested that Richard's body was mistreated after the battle.